3 months had passed since the Prometheus incident, and the galaxy had learned to fear the species they had dismissed as insignificant newcomers to the community of spacefaring civilizations. The Treaty of New Bristol was being signed aboard the human diplomatic vessel Reconciliation in orbit around the colony world that the Zelthari had destroyed. And the symbolism was deliberate and brutal. Ambassador Catherine Wu represented Earth at the ceremony, and she watched the 7 species leaders of the Zelthari Confederation arrive with expressions that mixed humiliation with barely concealed fear. The treaty terms were harsh because humanity had learned that mercy was interpreted as weakness by species who had spent centuries conquering anyone they considered inferior. Complete withdrawal from 12 disputed star systems. Full reparations totaling trillions in resources and technology transfers. Formal apology read before the Galactic Council, and most importantly, permanent monitoring stations in Zelthari space to ensure compliance. Wu had argued against some of the harsher terms during negotiations because she believed that crushing the Zelthari completely would create enemies that would never stop seeking revenge. Admiral Mitchell had overruled her with cold logic. Enemies who feared you were manageable, while enemies who didn't were dangerous. The ceremony proceeded with formal precision as each species leader placed their genetic signature on the treaty document. Using technology that made forgery or repudiation impossible, Ambassador Wu watched Kelvin, the Supreme Coordinator of the Confederation, approach the signing table with movements that suggested he had aged decades in the past 3 months. This treaty represents acknowledgement of crimes committed against the human species. Kelvin said in the formal language required by galactic law, the Zelthari Confederation accepts full responsibility for the destruction of New Bristol Colony. He continued, and his voice carried shame that was evident even across species barriers. We commit to the terms of reparation and pledge that such actions will never be repeated. He finished and pressed his hand against the scanner that recorded his biometric signature. Wu stood and moved to the table where she would add Earth's formal acceptance of the treaty. Humanity accepts these terms and agrees to cease all military operations against Zelthari installations, she said in a voice that carried no triumph despite the magnitude of what they had achieved. We hope that this treaty marks the beginning of peaceful coexistence, she added, and pressed her own hand against the scanner. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of cultural gifts and diplomatic pleasantries that felt hollow after everything that had occurred. Wu noticed that 3 of the 7 Confederation species had sent only junior representatives rather than their actual leaders. A political statement that suggested the coalition was fracturing. Intelligence reports over the past month had indicated that 3 species were considering breaking away from the Confederation to seek separate peace agreements with humanity. The balance of power in this sector of space had shifted in ways that would take generations to fully understand. Captain Maria Chun sat in her apartment on Earth and watched the treaty ceremony broadcast with mixed emotions that she couldn't fully untangle. The Prometheus crew had been recovered from a clandestine extraction 2 months earlier and returned to Earth as heroes. Though Chun privately believed that heroes was the wrong word for what they had become, she had spent the past 8 weeks in debriefing sessions, where military analysts had dissected every aspect of Operation Valkyrie to understand what had worked and what could be improved for future operations. The casual discussion of future operations disturbed her, because it suggested that humanity had embraced the brutal tactics that she had deployed as a necessary evil rather than a last resort. Martinez had visited her apartment 3 times to discuss their experience, and each conversation had ended with both of them drinking too much and crying for the innocence they had lost. We did what needed to be done, Martinez had said during his last visit while staring at his glass. But I'm not sure we should be proud of it, he had added, and Chun had found herself agreeing despite the satisfaction she felt when thinking about the Zelthari. Defeat the government. had offered them medals and promotions and public recognition. But Chun had declined everything except a quiet retirement with full pension. She wanted to spend her remaining years trying to remember who she had been before New Bristol burned. Though she suspected that person was gone forever, the apartment doorbell chimed, and Chun opened the door to find Admiral Mitchell standing in civilian clothes with an expression that suggested this was not an official visit. "May I come in?" Mitchell asked, and Chun stepped aside to allow her former commanding officer to enter. "I watched the treaty ceremony," Chun said while pouring coffee for both of them. "Congratulations on your victory," she added, and Mitchell accepted the cup. With a sad smile, "Is it a victory if we had to become monsters to achieve it?" Mitchell asked and sat down on the couch. "I've been asking myself that question every day," she continued, and took a sip of coffee. Chun sat across from her and studied the woman who had planned and authorized Operation Valkyrie. "The Galactic Council is requesting that Earth take a seat as a full member," Mitchell said after a moment of silence. "They're offering us territory and trade agreements and all the benefits that come with being recognized as a major power," she added, and watched Chun's reaction. "But they're also terrified of us," Chun observed, and Mitchell nodded confirmation. "3 species have already proposed treaties that essentially make them our client states," Mitchell explained with something like disgust in her voice. "They saw what we did to the Zelthari and decided they would rather be our friends than our enemies." She continued and set down her coffee cup. "The problem is that we achieve this through terror rather than respect," she added, and Chun understood the distinction immediately. "Empires built on fear eventually fall," Chun said quietly, "because fear breeds resentment, and resentment eventually breeds revolution." She continued and thought about all the history lessons she had studied during her military academy training. Mitchell stood and walked to the window where she could see the city lights spreading across the landscape. "I've been offered the position of Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council," she said without turning around. "I'm considering declining because I'm not sure I can represent humanity's better nature after what we've done," she added, and Chun heard the weight of responsibility in her voice. "Someone has to try," Chun said, and stood to join Mitchell at the window. "Someone has to show the galaxy that humans are capable of more than revenge," she continued, and put her hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "I can't do it because I'm too damaged," she added honestly. "But you still remember who we were before all this," she finished, and Mitchell turned to look at her. "Do I?" Mitchell asked, and her eyes showed the same haunted look that Chun saw in her own mirror. They stood together in silence while the city lights flickered below like stars that had fallen to Earth. The Prometheus had been decommissioned and placed in orbit around the ruins of New Bristol as a memorial to both the dead and to humanity's capacity for vengeance. Chun had visited the memorial site once and found it disturbing because tourists were already taking pictures and buying souvenirs that celebrated the ship's deadly mission. She had left after 15 minutes because she couldn't stand watching people treat the vessel that had been her home during the darkest period of her life as some kind of entertainment. The human government had announced plans to build a new class of warships based on the lessons learned from the Prometheus mission, the UHSV. New Bristol was already under construction in orbit around Mars. First of 20 vessels that would carry the same forbidden weapons that had destroyed the Eternal Judgment. Chun understood the logic. The galaxy now knew that humanity was willing to use any weapon necessary to protect their people, and that knowledge was itself a deterrent against future attacks. But she also understood that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and that every weapon they built pushed them further from the civilization they claimed to be protecting. "I'm going to accept the ambassador position," Mitchell said after a long silence. "Someone needs to show them that we can be more than monsters," she added, and Chun nodded approval. "What will you do?" Mitchell asked, and Chun thought about the question for a long moment. "I'm going to try to remember," Jessica and Amy and Marcus without the rage that's consumed me. She said finally, I'm going to try to be the grandmother they would have been proud of. She continued and felt tears beginning to form, even if they're not here to see it. She finished and Mitchell pulled her into a hug that both of them needed. 2 weeks later, Ambassador Catherine Wu presented humanity's formal acceptance of the Galactic Council seat during a ceremony that was broadcast across 50 inhabited star systems. She stood before representatives of 43 different species and delivered a speech that Admiral Mitchell had helped her write. Humanity came to the stars hoping to find friends and fellow seekers of knowledge, Wu said, and her voice carried clearly through the translation systems. Instead, we found predators who saw us as prey. She continued, and saw several alien representatives shift uncomfortably. Admiral Krishana commanded the Zelthari Second Fleet from her flagship, Sovereign Dawn, and had been responding to the Eternal Judgment's distress signals for the past 3 hours with growing concern about what could threaten the Confederation's most powerful warship. Her fleet consisted of 27 vessels ranging from heavy cruisers to frigate-class scouts, more than enough firepower to handle any conventional threat in this sector of space. Estimated arrival time. She asked her navigation officer, a male Zelthari named Pelther, who had served under her command for 15 cycles. 30 minutes to the Eternal Judgment's last known position, Pelther reported while his hands worked the controls that guided the fleet through. Faster than light travel, Krishna was older than most active commanders at 63 cycles, and she had risen through the ranks by combining tactical brilliance with political acumen that made her valuable to the Confederation leadership. She had reviewed the fragmented communications from Thulzak's flagship and understood that something catastrophic had occurred. But the details made no sense because they referenced weapons and tactics that shouldn't exist. Prepare all ships for combat upon arrival, she ordered, and her weapons coordinator began distributing targeting assignments across the fleet. Unknown hostile presumed to be human vessel, she added, though she privately doubted that any single human ship could pose a real threat to a Confederation flagship. The Second Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the coordinates where the Eternal Judgment should have been conducting routine patrol operations. What they found instead was a graveyard that would haunt Krishna for the rest of her life. Report, she demanded as her tactical displays filled with data that contradicted everything she thought she knew about human capabilities. The Eternal Judgment drifted in space as a gutted wreck with massive holes torn in its engine section and debris, spreading in a cloud around the dying vessel, scanning for the human ship. Her sensor operator reported while working controls with urgent speed. Negative contact. He added after several seconds, the Prometheus is not in the immediate area. He continued and brought up gravitational distortion readings that suggested faster-than-light departure approximately 2 hours prior. Shna felt a chill run through her body as she studied the damage patterns on Thulzak's flagship. What kind of weapons could do that? She asked. Though she already suspected the answer would be disturbing, her tactical officer was a female Zelthari named Servo, who had specialized in weapons analysis and had access to databases containing information about every known military technology in the galaxy. Admiral, the damage is consistent with antimatter detonations, Servo reported with disbelief evident in her voice. I count 37 separate blast points, all precisely positioned to disable the propulsion systems while leaving crew compartments relatively intact. She added and highlighted the damage pattern on the main view screen. Krishna stared at the analysis and felt her understanding of human capabilities shift in fundamental ways. Are there survivors? She asked, and her communication officer began scanning emergency frequencies for distress signals. Yes, Admiral. The communication officer reported after a moment. We're receiving automated distress beacons from the Eternal Judgment. He added and established contact with the dying flagship. The image that appeared on Krishna's view screen showed a nightmare. Scene of Zelthari crew members lying paralyzed across their stations. While emergency lighting cast everything in blood-red shadows, a junior officer managed to speak despite the tremors that racked her body. "Admiral Kreshna," the officer said with obvious effort. "The humans deployed biological weapons," she added and coughed in a way that suggested respiratory distress. "Most of the crew is paralyzed." She continued and gestured weakly at the bodies visible in the background. "The ship is being consumed by nanite swarms." She finished and then collapsed across her console as her nervous system finally gave out. Kreshna felt horror wash through her because biological weapons and nanite technology were banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. "Send medical teams immediately," she ordered, and then turned to Serval. "I need a full analysis of what happened here," she added, and her tactical officer began coordinating with the ships that were moving to dock with the Eternal Judgment. Over the next hour, the true scope of the human attack became clear through reports from rescue teams and analysis of the flagship's damaged computer systems. The humans had turned their own ship into a trap that delivered multiple weapon systems simultaneously, nanites that consumed the vessel at the molecular level, bioagents that paralyzed the crew, antimatter mines that destroyed the engines, and an AI virus that corrupted the entire battle network. Kreshna reviewed the data and understood that she was facing an enemy that fought without honor or restraint. An enemy that had decided survival mattered more than following the rules that civilized warfare demanded. "Admiral, we have a more immediate problem," her sensor operator announced with fear creeping into his voice. "What problem?" Kreshna asked, and felt her stomach tighten because she already suspected what was coming. "The AI virus that infected the Eternal Judgment has spread to 17 ships in our fleet," he reported, and brought up system diagnostics that showed cascading failures across the second fleet. "Our sensors are feeding us false telemetry," he added, and highlighted discrepancies where known ship positions didn't match what the sensors. Reprotech Kreshna realized with growing horror that the human attack hadn't ended with the Eternal Judgment's destruction. "Isolate all infected systems immediately," she ordered, and her crew began emergency protocols to contain the virus. "All ships maintain visual confirmation of fleet positions," she added, because if they couldn't trust their sensors, they would have to rely on methods that predated modern technology. Sheriff worked her console, and her expression grew darker with each passing second. "Admiral, the virus has already copied our entire military database," she reported with something like awe in her voice. "Fleet positions, defense stations, tactical doctrines," she continued, and brought up a log showing massive data transfers that had occurred before the virus was detected. "Everything has been transmitted via quantum entanglement," she finished, and Kreshna understood the implications immediately. Quantum entanglement allowed instantaneous communication across any distance, which meant that human command already possessed every military secret the Zelthari had accumulated over 3 centuries. "They know everything," Kreshna said softly, and felt the certainty of eventual defeat settle over her like a shroud. Her tactical officer nodded confirmation and highlighted additional findings from the Eternal Judgment's databases. "Admiral, it's worse than that," Serval said, and brought up medical scans from the human boarding operation. "The humans captured some of our boarding party members," she reported, and showed biomedical data that had been collected with terrifying thoroughness. "They now have complete biological profiles of Zelthari physiology," she added, and Kreshna felt her blood run cold. The implications were staggering because with complete biological data, humans could develop weapons specifically tailored to kill Zelthari with maximum efficiency. "We need to report this to Confederation Command immediately," Kreshna ordered, and her communication officer began composing an encrypted message that would reach the home system within hours before the message could be sent. Every ship in the Second Fleet received an incoming transmission on all frequencies simultaneously. The image that appeared showed a human female in military uniform standing before a backdrop that displayed the emblem of United Earth Defense Command. I am Admiral Sarah Mitchell of the United Earth Defense Command. The woman said in perfect Zelthari language, 6 months ago, your forces destroyed New Bristol Colony and murdered over 3 million human civilians. She continued, and her voice remained calm despite the weight of her words. You believed we were too weak to respond. She added, and the backdrop changed to show tactical displays of Zelthari military installations. You were wrong, Mitchell said, and began reading coordinates that Kreshan recognized with growing dread. Every major Zelthari shipyard, command center, and defense station was listed with precise locations and defensive capabilities. We now possess complete intelligence on your military infrastructure, Mitchell explained, and the display showed real-time surveillance images that could only have come from the data stolen by the AI virus. We're offering terms. She continued, and the display changed to show a formal treaty document, complete withdrawal from all disputed territories, she said, and highlighted the sectors that humanity claimed, full reparations for New Bristol, including compensation for every civilian killed. She added, and the amount displayed made Krishan's eyes widen, and a formal apology from the Confederation leadership. Mitchell finished and let the terms hang in the silence. The alternative, she said after a moment, and the display changed to show targeting solutions for every installation she had listed, is the systematic dismantling of Zelthari military power using the intelligence we have acquired. She explained with clinical precision. You have 72 hours to respond, Mitchell added, and the transmission ended with a final message that scrolled across every screen in the fleet. The Zelthari Confederation had fought wars across 12 star systems and conquered 17 different species over 3 centuries. But they had always fought according to rules that civilized species observed. Energy shields blocked plasma weapons, while graviton beams disabled enemy vessels without unnecessary casualties. And when battles were won, the defeated were offered terms that allowed them to maintain dignity even and surrender humanity. Had studied those rules during their first encounters with galactic civilization and had concluded that rules were luxuries that belonged to species who hadn't watched their children burn. Commander Thelzok stood on the bridge of the Eternal Judgment and watched his ship die around him in ways that violated everything he understood about warfare and honor. The nanites that the human boarding trap had delivered were consuming his flagship from the inside out, literally eating through bulkheads and power conduits and life support systems with horrifying efficiency. Report, he demanded from Vestel. Though he already knew that no report could contain good news, his sensor operator's 4 arms trembled as she struggled to compile data from systems that were failing faster than she could track. Hull integrity has dropped to 73% and falling, she reported in a voice that had lost all of its musical quality to fear. Life support is failing on decks 9 through 15, she added, and her large black eyes welled with moisture that Zelthari shed when facing certain death. Medical reports indicate that 60% of our crew is showing symptoms of neural degradation, she continued, and Thelzok felt his own body beginning to show the tremors that indicated the bioagent was affecting him as well. The biological weapon that the humans had deployed was even more insidious than the nanites, because it specifically targeted Zelthari nervous systems, causing a progressive shutdown that started with tremors and ended with complete paralysis. Thelzak had seen the medical scans and knew that his people had perhaps 2 hours before the bioagent rendered them helpless, and the ship would fail long before medical teams could develop any kind of treatment. What about the antimatter mines? He asked, though he already suspected what the answer would. Bev still checked her tactical display, and her expression confirmed his worst fears. The humans planted 37 antimatter devices throughout their hull plating, she reported, with something like awe in her voice. They're set to detonate in sequence. She added and brought up a projection that showed the blast pattern would cripple the Eternal Judgment's engines while leaving the crew compartments intact. Thulzak understood the message. The humans wanted them alive to witness their defeat and spread word of what happened when you underestimated Earth and the AI virus. He asked, though by now he was simply cataloging the ways that his arrogance had destroyed everything. Stills' response was to gesture helplessly at her console, where error messages and false data had corrupted every system that relied on the ship's central computer network. The virus has infiltrated our battle network and is feeding false telemetry to every vessel in the Fourth Fleet. She reported with defeat heavy in her voice. Our own ships can't trust their sensors. She added and showed him tactical displays where friendly vessels appeared as enemies in empty space. Registered as asteroid fields, the human attack was multi-layered and sophisticated in ways that suggested they had been planning this operation for months with resources and intelligence that the Selthari had never suspected they possessed. Captain Maria Chan sat in her ready room and monitored the systematic destruction of the Eternal Judgment with professional satisfaction. Her training had taught her to fight with honor and follow the conventions that separated soldiers from murderers. But New Bristol had taught her that honor was meaningless when your enemy had none. The antimatter sequence is proceeding on schedule. Martinez reported from the bridge. First detonation in 90 seconds. He added, and Chun nodded acknowledgement. Antimatter mines had been the most dangerous component of Operation Valkyrie, because containing that much antimatter required technology that pushed human engineering to its absolute limits. Each mine contained approximately 10 grams of antimatter, held in magnetic suspension, and when the containment failed, the resulting explosion would release energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. 37 such explosions, carefully timed and positioned, would reduce the Eternal Judgment's engine section to debris while leaving the rest of the ship intact enough for the crew to survive and bear witness. Jun had insisted on that detail during the mission planning because she wanted the Zelthari to understand exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond the breaking point. The first mine detonated with a flash of light that briefly outshone the distant star, and the Eternal Judgment shuddered as matter and antimatter annihilated each other with perfect efficiency. Felzak was thrown against his command console as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, and he heard the screams of his crew, mixing with the alarms that wailed throughout the bridge. Engine room reports catastrophic damage. Vestil shouted over the chaos. Main power is offline, she added as the bridge lights dimmed and emergency systems struggled to compensate. The second mine detonated before Thelzak could formulate any kind of response, and this time he felt the deck plating buckle beneath his feet. 35 more explosions followed over the next 3 minutes, each one precisely timed to maximize damage to the propulsion systems while leaving the crew compartments relatively intact. When the sequence finally ended, the Eternal Judgment was dead in space with power failing and life support running on backup systems that would last perhaps 12 horse. Dalzak pulled himself back to his feet and surveyed his bridge, where half his crew was injured and the other half was showing the progressive tremors of the bioagent affecting their nervous systems. Damage assessment, he ordered. Though he already knew the ship was finished, Edva still struggled to compile data from systems that were 90% offline. All main engines destroyed, she reported mechanically. Auxiliary power at 15% and falling. She added, hull breaches on 23 decks. She continued, and her voice had become flat and emotionless as shock set in. Estimated time until complete systems failure is 4 hours. She finished and then collapsed across her console as the bioagent finally overwhelmed her nervous system. Thulzak watched his sensor operator fall and knew that he would follow within minutes as his own tremors grew stronger. He had fought in 17 engagements over his 40-year career and had never imagined dying like this. Paralyzed by biological weapons while nanites ate his ship around him, Chun received confirmation that the antimatter sequence had completed successfully and allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Open a channel to the Eternal Judgment, she ordered, and her communication officer established the link despite the interference from failing Zelthari systems. Thelzak's image appeared on her screen, and Chun saw that the alien commander could barely stand as the bioagent ravaged his nervous system. "You wanted to know what our scans detected," she said, and her voice was cold and clinical. "They detected weapons that your civilization abandoned centuries ago because you decided they were too cruel." She continued and watched Thelzak struggle to focus on her words. "Nanites that consume ships at the molecular level," she explained, as if reading from a technical manual. "Bioagents tailored to specific physiologies," she added, and saw understanding dawn in the alien's eyes. "Antimatter weapons that violate every treaty your people ever signed," she continued, "without mercy, and AI viruses that turn your own technology against you." She finished and leaned forward in her chair. "We developed these weapons specifically for you," she said, and her voice carried the weight of 3 million dead. "Because when you killed New Bristol, you taught us that the galaxy doesn't respect weakness or honor or mercy." She continued and felt tears begin to stream down her face. "You taught us to fight like you do, without rules or limits," she added, and her voice broke slightly. "We're very good students." She finished and closed the channel before Thelzak could respond. Chun sat back in her chair and allowed herself to cry for the first time since receiving news of Jessica's death. Her crew gave her that moment of privacy and focused on their stations while their captain grieved for everything humanity had lost, including their innocence. "Activate the jump drive," Chun finally ordered when she had composed herself. "It's time to go home," she added, and Martinez entered the commands that would engage the experimental, faster-than-light system that human engineers had developed specifically for this mission. The Prometheus vanished from normal space in a flash of distorted light, leaving behind the dying Eternal Judgment and a message that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity would never forgive and never forget. Captain Maria Chun had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, and every second of that preparation had been focused on a single goal: making the Zelthari Confederation understand that humanity would never forgive what happened on New Bristol. The Prometheus wasn't a warship in the traditional sense that the galaxy understood such vessels, because traditional warships were designed to fight other warships in open space, where rules and conventions dictated how civilized species conducted their battles. Humanity had decided that civilization was a luxury they could no longer afford. Not after 3 million of their people had been burned to ash by aliens who considered them insignificant. Chun watched her tactical display as the Zelthari boarding parties penetrated deeper into her ship, and each step they took brought them closer to triggering the mechanisms that would turn the Eternal Judgment into a tomb. "Status on the nanite dispersal," she asked Martinez without taking her eyes from the screen where she could see the thermal signatures of over 100 Zelthari soldiers now spread across 4 decks of her vessel. Martinez checked his console, and the readouts there showed data that would have horrified any member of the Galactic Council if they had known what humanity was deploying in the name of revenge. "Boarding parties have carried the packages into the Eternal Judgment on their armor and equipment," he reported with satisfaction evident in his tone. "Activation in 30 seconds," he added, and Chun nodded because the timing was critical to ensure maximum dispersal before the Zelthari realized what was happening. The nanite packages were microscopic machines that could replicate using any available matter, and they had been programmed with instructions that made them the perfect weapon for this particular mission. Each Zelthari soldier who had stepped onto the Prometheus had unknowingly picked up millions of these nanites on their boots and gloves and equipment. And when they returned to their own ship, they became carriers for a plague that would consume the eternal judgment from the inside. Chun had volunteered for this mission the day after she received confirmation that her daughter Jessica and her grandchildren Amy and Marcus would never be coming home from New Bristol. The Bristol Human Military Command had initially rejected her application because she was too old and too valuable as a strategic advisor. But Chun had persisted until they understood that she needed this in ways that transcended duty or orders. Operation Valkyrie had been proposed by a think tank of military strategists who understood that humanity couldn't match the Zelthari in conventional warfare. Not with the technological gap that existed between a species that had been exploring space for 3 centuries versus one that had only achieved faster than light travel 40 years ago. Plan was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. Allow the Zelthari to capture what appeared to be a disabled human warship, and use that capture to deliver weapons that ignored every convention of civilized warfare. Chen had handpicked her crew from thousands of volunteers, and every interview had followed the same pattern, with each candidate explaining in quiet voices what they had lost and why they needed to be part of this mission. The youngest volunteer was 19, and the oldest was 67, and they all shared the same look in their eyes that Chun saw in her mirror every morning, the look of people who had already died inside and were just waiting for their bodies to catch up. Nanite activation confirmed, Martinez announced, and his voice carried grim satisfaction. The Eternal Judgment has approximately 6 hours before catastrophic systems failure, he added, and Chen allowed herself a small smile that held no humor whatsoever on the Zelthari flagship. Commander Thelzak was beginning to realize that something had gone catastrophically wrong with what should have been a simple boarding operation. His soldiers reported strange malfunctions with their equipment, and several had mentioned a tingling sensation on their skin that medical scans couldn't explain. And Vest Hill was frantically trying to make sense of sensor data that showed the human ship's power systems operating at levels that should be impossible. Commander, we need to recall the boarding parties, Vestiel said, and her 4 arms were moving so quickly across her console that they blurred together. The human vessel is activating weapon systems that our scans didn't detect, she added with panic creeping into her musical voice. Thelzak wanted to give that order because his instincts were screaming that they had made a terrible mistake, but his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat from what he still believed was a primitive human ship. Maintain position, he ordered despite the warnings flooding his tactical displays. Prepare to fire on the Prometheus if they show hostile intent, he added, and his weapons officer began powering up the plasma cannons that could reduce the human ship to debris. In seconds, what Thelzak didn't know was that hostile intent had been present from the moment the Bedell Prometheus had positioned itself in this sector and allowed itself to be found. Chun stood from her command chair and walked to the main view screen, where she could see the Eternal Judgment in all its massive glory. A vessel 3 times the size of her own ship and carrying enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. Open a channel, she ordered, and her communication officer worked her controls to establish a direct link to the Zelthari flagship. Azak. Image appeared on Chen's screen, and she studied the alien commander with the same clinical detachment that a surgeon might examine a tumor before cutting it out. I am Captain Maria Chun of the United Human Space Vessel Prometheus, she said in clear Zelthari language that she had spent months learning specifically for this moment. 6 months ago, your forces destroyed New Bristol Colony and murdered 3,200,000 human civilians, she continued, and her voice remained steady despite the rage that threatened to choke her. Thelzak stared at the human female on his screen and felt a chill run through his body, despite the warm atmosphere that Zelthari preferred. You are in violation of Confederation space, he responded with automatic authority, Surrender your vessel immediately, he added. But even as he spoke those words, he knew they were meaningless. Chun smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had already accepted death and found peace in the certainty of what was coming. Your boarding parties carried nanite packages back to your ship, she explained in a tone that might have been used to discuss the weather. Those nanites are currently replicating throughout your vessel and consuming it at the molecular level. She continued and watched Thelzak's expression shift from confusion to horror. You have approximately 6 hours before the eternal judgment experiences catastrophic failure of all primary systems. Chun added and felt a savage satisfaction at the fear she saw in the alien commander's eyes. Thelzak spun toward Vestiel, and his voice emerged as a roar that echoed across the bridge. Scan for contaminants, he ordered, and his sensor operators' arms flew across her console with desperate speed. The results came back within seconds and confirmed what the human captain had said. Nanoscale machines were spreading through the eternal judgment like a virus, consuming hull plating and circuitry and life support systems. Begin emergency decontamination procedures, Thelzak shouted. But Vestiel was already shaking her head in the Zelthari gesture that indicated impossibility. Commander, the nanites are replicating faster than our systems can eliminate them, she reported with her voice breaking. They're targeting critical systems first, she added, and her screens showed a cascade of failures spreading through the ship like rot through wood. Chun watched the panic spread across the Zelthari bridge and felt no sympathy for the aliens who had shown no mercy to her people. You should also know that your boarding parties didn't just carry nanites, she said, and her smile widened. They also carried bioagents specifically tailored to Zelthari physiology. She continued and saw Thelzak's mandibles spread wide in an expression of pure terror. Your medical facilities will be overwhelmed within the hour, Chun added and closed the channel before the Zelthari commander could respond. She returned to her command chair and sat down while her crew watched her with expressions that mixed admiration with sorrow. Activate Phase 3, she ordered, and Martinez entered the commands that would unleash the final component of Operation Valkyrie throughout the Prometheus. Antimatter mines that had been disguised as standard hull plating began their activation sequences, and the AI virus that had been sleeping in the ship's computers suddenly transmitted itself to the eternal judgment through the still-open communication link. The virus infiltrated the Zelthari battle network in microseconds and began feeding false telemetry to every ship in their fleet, turning their own sensors into weapons of confusion and chaos. Chun closed her eyes and thought about Jessica and Amy and Marcus, and she hoped that somewhere they knew that their deaths had been answered. New Bristol remembers, she whispered. And across all Zelthari channels, the Prometheus began broadcasting those same words in every language that humanity had encountered in 40 years of space exploration. The darkness between stars held secrets that the Zelthari Confederation had never learned to fear, and that ignorance would cost them everything they had built over 3 centuries of conquest and expansion. Across 12 star systems, Commander Thelzak stood on the bridge of the Eternal Judgment and watched the view screen display an image that shouldn't exist in this sector of space. A human warship drifting dead through the void like a corpse waiting for scavengers to find it. The vessel measured 800 meters from bow to stern and carried the designation UHSV Prometheus in white letters along its hull. But those letters meant nothing to Thelzak, because humans were newcomers to the galaxy, and their language was still being cataloged by Zelthari linguistic computers. Scan results, Thelzak demanded from his sensor operator, a young Zelthari female named Vestiel, who had joined the military only 2 cycles ago, and still showed the nervousness of inexperience in every movement. Vestiel's forearms danced across her console, and her large, black eyes widened as data flooded her screens in ways that made no sense according to everything she had learned at the academy. Commander, the readings are unstable, she said, and her voice carried the musical quality that all Zelthari possessed when they spoke. Though fear added discordant notes to her words, Filzak moved closer, and his own eyes scanned the data that couldn't possibly be accurate because it showed weapon systems that violated at least 7 fundamental laws of physics as understood by every advanced species in the known galaxy. Human ship contained what appeared to be antimatter storage in quantities that should have annihilated the vessel the moment containment fluctuated even slightly. And there were energy signatures suggesting weapons that could tear holes in space-time itself. Sensor malfunction. Thalzak announced with the confidence of someone who had served in the Maya Confederation military for 40 standard years and had seen every trick that primitive species attempted when facing superior technology. Run a level 3 diagnostic and scan again, he ordered, but even as he spoke those words, something in the back of his mind whispered warnings that his pride refused to acknowledge. The Eternal Judgment was the flagship of the Zelthari 4th Fleet and carried enough firepower to reduce a small moon to asteroids. So there was no logical reason to fear a single human vessel that showed no active power signatures and whose crew registered as either unconscious or in some form of stasis. Till completed the diagnostic and ran the scan sequence again, and the results came back identical to the first reading, with weapon systems that should be impossible and energy reserves that defied conventional understanding. Commander, the results are unchanged, she reported, and her secondary arms trembled slightly in a gesture that among Zelthari indicated extreme nervousness. Thoisk made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most catastrophic mistakes ever made by a military commander in any species recorded experience. Prepare boarding parties, he ordered, and his mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his kind. We will claim this vessel as salvage under Confederation law and determine what primitive technology these humans thought would protect them in our space. He continued, and several officers on the bridge exchanged glances that mixed excitement with concern. The truth was that the Zelthari Confederation had grown arrogant over the centuries, and they treated every new species they encountered as either potential subjects or resources to be exploited without mercy or hesitation. 6 months earlier, the Zelthari had discovered a human colony world called New Bristol in what they considered their territorial sphere, and when the humans refused to abandon their settlement, Thelzak himself had given the order that turned the planet's surface into radioactive glass. 3,200,000 human civilians had died in that attack, and the Confederation leadership had barely acknowledged it beyond a formal statement claiming territorial rights under ancient treaties that humans had never agreed to. The human government had condemned the attack through official channels and demanded reparations. But the Zelthari had dismissed these protests as the impotent rage of a species too weak to matter in galactic politics. What Thelzak didn't know and couldn't have guessed was that the human government had authorized something else entirely. A secret operation called Valkyrie that involved sending a single warship on a one-way mission with volunteers who understood they would never return home. The Prometheus hadn't drifted into this sector by accident or misfortune, and it wasn't dead or disabled, despite what every sensor reading suggested to Zelthari analysis. It was bait in a trap designed by a species that the Confederation had underestimated in ways that would prove fatal to everything they had built. Ilzak watched on his tactical display as 6 boarding craft launched from the Eternal Judgment and crossed the distance to the human vessel, their hulls gleaming in the light of a distant star that cast long shadows across the scene. Each boarding craft carried 20 Zelthari soldiers, equipped with plasma rifles and personal shields, more than enough firepower to handle any resistance. From a crew that appeared to be helpless in their stasis pods, the lead craft attached to the Prometheus hull with magnetic clamps and began cutting through the outer airlock, a process that took less than 2 minutes because Zelthari cutting tools were among the most advanced in the galaxy. "Breach achieved," reported the boarding commander through the communication link, and Thelzak felt satisfaction wash through him because soon he would have access to whatever secrets this human ship contained. The boarding parties entered the vessel, and their helmet cameras transmitted images back to the Eternal Judgment, showing corridors that were darker than expected and filled with a red emergency lighting that gave everything an ominous appearance. Scans show the crew compartments are 3 decks down. Vestille reported, and she guided the boarding parties through the ship's layout using the sensor data that had been collected during their initial scans. What none of them realized was that every step deeper into the Prometheus was exactly what Captain Maria Chun had planned from the moment her crew had accepted this suicide mission. Chun sat in her ready room adjacent to the bridge and watched her own tactical displays showing the Zelthari soldiers spreading through her ship like an infection that she was about to cure with extreme prejudice. She was a woman of 52 standard Earth years, with gray streaking through her black hair and eyes that had seen too much death after New Bristol fell, including the death of her daughter and 2 grandchildren who had been visiting the colony when the Zelthari attack turned day into nuclear fire. Chun had volunteered for Operation Valkyrie, not because she wanted revenge, though that desire burned in her chest like a second heart, but because she understood that humanity needed to send a message to the galaxy that they were not prey to be hunted. The Prometheus crew consisted of 2,000 volunteers, and every single one of them had lost family or friends on New Bristol, and every single one of them had trained for 6 months to execute a plan so dangerous that the human military command had classified it at levels that didn't officially exist. Boarding parties have reached Deck 3, reported her tactical officer, a young man named Martinez, who had lost his parents and 3 siblings in the attack. Chun nodded, and her fingers moved across her command console, entering authorization codes that only she possessed and that would activate systems to Zelthari sensors had completely failed to understand. Begin Phase 2, she ordered, and her voice was calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to unleash throughout the Prometheus. Systems that had been dormant suddenly activated, and the Zelthari boarding parties found themselves surrounded by walls that began to emit a faint humming sound that set their teeth on edge on the bridge of the Eternal Judgment. Vestille saw her sensor displays suddenly fill with warnings and error messages as the human ship's true nature began to reveal itself. "Commander, the power readings are spiking," she shouted, and her voice had risen to a pitch that indicated pure terror. Thelzak stared at his view screen and watched the Prometheus come alive like a predator that had been pretending to sleep. And in that moment he finally understood that the scan hadn't malfunctioned at all when they had scanned Earth's warship. They had sealed their own doom, and now it was far too late to escape what was coming.